Well, a convicted murderer who was released on an unescorted pass in Oshawa returned to custody as expected this afternoon. 65-year-old Darren Scott Ray was temporarily freed earlier this week. He was convicted in the rape and killing of a 14-year-old boy back in 1987, for which he's serving a life sentence. And Durham police had issued a warning earlier this week that Roy was going to be allowed out for 72 hours, but the reason why was never released. And police say he's now back in custody. And for more on this, we're joined live by Joseph Neuberger, criminal defense lawyer. Thanks a lot for joining us. I want to ask you this. Why was the reason for the release never released? And is that common?
Well, this was likely part of a reintegration program for Mr. Ray. So generally, it's not a parole release. So Corrections Canada is not going to make an official announcement. And the idea is to try and reintegrate eventually an offender to the community. And sometimes by making an announcement, it makes it harder for Corrections Canada to do their job to gauge whether the person they're releasing on a temporary absence will succeed on it or not. So these are not things that they generally announce, but the police were notified and then they put out the particular warning for the Oshawa area.
What do you want to say about these releases, about this process?
Okay, so, I have some sort of a specialty in risk assessment and stuff. And so generally with first-degree murder cases, particularly one that has this type of facts, is extremely severe and repugnant to the community. And so in order for him to be released, which is part of, I have to assume, his reintegration program, because he's getting close to 40 years in jail now, they're assessing his risk and determining that it's low enough that he's safe to try and put into the community for a short period of time. I see risk profile remaining high for this type of offending profile, and this individual had prior convictions as well. So my concern is with respect to the assessment of the overall risk of somebody who's 65, had been involved in such a heinous criminal act with other criminal antecedents, and I don't see that risk profile really getting to the stage where they can be fully reintegrated into the community. That's just my opinion, and I have not read anything on this gentleman, but I have concerns. Most of the time, this is very rare, particularly with a first-degree murder conviction. But I have some concerns about the assessment of risk.
What does reintegration into the public typically consist of? Like, what should we know about this?
Okay, so it does make sense when you're reintegrating individuals, offenders, into the community, that there is a process where you gradually do an integration. So it can start off with unescorted absences for 48 hours and then 72 hours under very strict conditions and boundaries. And you start to see if the person can handle this period of liberty and adhere to the strict conditions that they have. That is a very good way to gauge that they may be successful upon reintegration. Then the next stage is eventually they'll be released on a parole to a halfway house, and then they have to abide by those terms and conditions. And then eventually, if they're successful, they'll have a full parole release. That's generally what it is. It includes individuals who are with short-term and very long-term sentences. That's what generally the process of reintegration is. But the ultimate goal, when they're released on full parole, is that they'll be living in the community.
And as we begin to wrap up, for people who have objections to this happening in their communities, what options do they have?
Not a lot. I mean, this is within the discretion of Corrections Canada. This has to be okayed by the parole board. Eventually, full parole is a decision to be made by the parole board. That is an agency where people are appointed to. I think their options are to speak to their members of parliament. They can write to them, try and get meetings, speak to them, send in letters to Corrections Canada if these are things they're very concerned about. Become active so that your voice can be heard and you're advocating. But it's not just about being in the community, let's say Oshawa versus Toronto or anywhere else. It's about, concerns about high-risk individuals being released, because we do have reintegration. Many offenders reintegrate very well into the community without recidivism. So we have to be careful about what we choose to battle on. But for things like this, I think people's voices can be heard through government, meaning speak to your MP and other sources like that.
Criminal defense lawyer Joseph Neuberger. Thank you.
Thank you, Bakari. Take care.
You too.